Good afternoon, Your Highness. Great to see you again, and members of the Cabinet, which I saw on the screen. Sheikh Maktoum, it's always a pleasure to be back at the Africa Global Business Forum and listen very carefully to Her Excellency Reem Al Hashmi laying out the role of the UAE in Africa, which is her portfolio and a very impressive portfolio, particularly driven by this conference every year for the last 5 years. It's a pleasure to sit down with you because we sat down together 2 years ago, Your Excellency, at the Government Summit, which has been a landmark event here in the UAE, as you know. And we're talking about African integration for the future. And I marvel at a continent that has a population of 1.2 billion people. But my first visit to Africa was in the early 1990s. And back then, as you well know, the perspective was always with the colonial partners and not looking cross-border, not having an umbrella organization to foster trade. You're a huge proponent of the African Union. Can the African Union evolve to be the umbrella organization that brings together all the different 6 different regional blocks of Africa to accelerate cross-border investment? Is it realistic? And what sort of timeline are you looking at?
It's very realistic. And to begin with, let me quickly say that history, I'm talking about what we should understand by integration, first of all, the meaning of it, and the weight it carries for the continent. History divided the continent, and with it, the divisions and the inefficiencies that arose actually prevented Africa being as prosperous as it should have been. So we are looking at bringing, and every African, I think, looks at it this way. They want to see cooperation across the continent, countries working together, people coming together to trade, to invest, to meet their kind of expectations or aspirations as the case may hold. So it's very realistic that, therefore, to begin with, as we have regional economic communities, one, that these regional economic communities do what needs to be done for them to come together, and maybe eventually the communities themselves get together for continental integration, where you may therefore find that the whole continent is actually now one block instead of so many blocks adding up to make it a fully integrated African continent. So it's very realistic, I think. And we are beginning to see good progress in different parts of our continent. If you look at these regional economic communities, you find a number of steps have been taken and progress has been already made. And there is more to be done, absolutely. But I think the momentum is there, and it's up to the governments, the private sector, to keep working together and making this a reality, which I think should be soon. If you see where we are now and where we were 20 years ago, I think progress has been made.
Good. A number of different acronyms, right? ECOWAS, SADC, COMESA, ECAS for Eastern and Central Africa, the EAC, the East African Community.
Right.
Realistically, though, is it the collaboration that you'd like to see? You're a country of just over 12 million people. The collaboration within regional trade blocs to accelerate almost a European Union-like structure for Africa within the African Union itself. What's the timeline are you looking for? 10 years that's realistically going to have to take place?
I think between 5 and 10 years, we will see more progress adding to what we already have realized. If you look at different regions, let's say you mentioned the ECOWAS. ECOWAS has made progress, especially in the area of free movement of people. very significantly.
It is significant.
If you look at the East African region, even more progress has been realized. For example, in the area of customs union and integration even in the area of infrastructure that bring the countries of the East African community together, whether it is telecommunications in the area of realizing one area network where there are no roaming charges across the East African countries, or the plans and part of those plans already executed in terms of meeting the needs in the area of power, where electricity is being shared and the transmission lines are cutting across the countries and therefore supplying power to each other in the region. The plans that are there in the area of railway networks, and so on and so forth. So you can see the infrastructure coming together. You can see more trade and investments across countries of different regions. If you go to SADC in fact is also ahead in terms of intra-regional trade. They've made headways. Whichever bloc you're talking about, first of all, these blocs developed because of certain similarities these areas had.
It's a completely different mindset than what we had a decade ago. Can we get to non-tariff barriers right across the board, free trade with no tariffs amongst Africa?
If we are seeing it work, say, in the East African region, that means, and we see other things working in other regions, that's already a big step forward. So, and as I said from the beginning, when we see these regional economic communities working very well together and making this progress, it means later on, these regional economic communities will join up. And actually that completes the continental free trade area that we are looking at. As we continue to carry out reforms within regional economic communities, or across the continent, as is beginning to happen now, because reforms across the continent, the leaders of Africa have come together around, and even the people of the continent are supporting this even much more. They want to see that Africa comes together and people can freely move and do business and invest as they should.
I often make reference, as emerging markets editor for CNN, the idea of an African renaissance. We see the private sector and the discussions we had here at the forum, great minds leaping in across border to do investments in Africa, which is phenomenal, which didn't happen before. But I think the ultimate test, is it not, for the African Union has been its role in security. So it's been able to play a role in security, which builds confidence for business in the future as well. We've seen it on 3 or 4 occasions over the last 5 years. Has that been the ultimate test for the African Union and integration, if you can have a security integration, political integration, and economic integration? Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would agree with that. And all that is happening. We see more cooperation across the continent, countries working together to deal with problems that may be in certain parts of these regions. You saw, for example, how in West Africa, under ECOWAS, countries in that region came together to handle the problem of the Gambia. You will see how countries in the East African region have contributed and come together to deal with the problems under the AU in Somalia. You will see under the AU itself, but it could be AU working with the UN, but Africans are working together to deal with these specific areas that are of security concern, and people have been cooperating, working together. So it's in the economic area or security area or the political reforms that are necessary to, for the continent, for some of these problems to be addressed. The African Union is right at the center of it, and you can see that things are really holding.
You brought up the Gambia, and I want to discuss the kind of fits and starts of democracy in Africa. And I don't want to sound like the pedantic American trying to impose democracy. That's not my role here today. But we have different phases of democracy, models that are working, and I would say models that are not working. So in the Gambia with President Jammeh, he didn't want to leave, and then the African Union intervened, which was, I think, was a very good sign. Somebody who was president here at the Africa Global Business Forum in the last few years was the former president of Ghana. He served one term and left peacefully. When can we find an equilibrium of governance, election, departure, election, departure? If the society wants them in place, they stay. But they don't overstay the welcome if society says no. How do we find that balance?
Well, the balance will always be found, and it's about what people of any country will decide to do at any one point, and what they feel about the outcome. But democracy will always be challenged, no matter wherever you are. You may say all kinds of things across our continent and point to different things happening in different parts of the continent. But as we know, even all the democracies are being challenged.
You can say that again.
Absolutely. So you look at the United States, you look at Europe, you look at whichever part of the world. There are challenges that will have to be addressed. And these challenges are not unconnected with or unrelated to whatever is happening within that geographical space or country or areas you are talking about. So I think we are looking at the overall level of progress. In Africa, you may have one case you would insist on and being problematic, but if you look at largely the whole continent, a number of countries are at peace with themselves and with each other, if you look at these regions. But there will be problems that arise from many things that happened maybe many years ago. Africa, as I said to begin with, when I was talking about how history has left it divided and left a lot of inefficiencies with us, it was also speaking to some of the challenges even in politics of the country, of different countries of the continent. And therefore, sometimes we are not surprised that there are these problems that happen. The most important thing is the African Union or these regions have actually structures and institutions to try and deal with them when it comes to that level that is of concern to the continent or to different regions.
So it's a profound change. Your thoughts on Kenya and the elections, because they have electronic polling. There's disputes about how transparent it was. They went for a re-election of the poll, not great turnout, but it's stabilized. It's not what we saw in 2007. What are your thoughts about Kenya?
Well, I don't want to sound like I'm an expert on these matters across the continent, but I think, again, from what I said earlier, we are seeing Kenya has gone through certain difficulties to do with elections and so on and so forth. But Kenya is also doing what it needs to do to resolve these problems.
Right.
There remain challenges, but I think the people of any country will really stand up to these challenges and find a way forward. And maybe the measure, therefore, also of progress or success made will be the people themselves of these countries. But I think challenges, progress, and that's what happens almost everywhere.
So I was going to say, it's an advancement from where we were in 2007, right? So
yeah,
in a decade, it's a very
yes.
different landscape, is what you're suggesting.
We haven't seen that kind of scale of violence or outcry happen this time around as it happened in 2007 or 2008. So,
Great. During the government summit, Your Excellency, I asked a very pressing question. If I sat down with you in 2017, would I still call you President Kagame?
yes.
Because it needed a constitutional change, and you had overwhelming support of nearly 99% for the constitutional change. Now you have basically a mandate to stay perhaps another 17 years to 2034.
Yeah.
Why do you think this model works after what took place in the 1990s? Why do you think this model is what the people wanted in Rwanda, in your case?
Yeah, because you asked whether you would still be calling me president. More importantly, the people of Rwanda still call me president because in the end, they are the ones who have to decide.
Yes.
And the proof of that the people of Rwanda decided is the peaceful nature of the conduct of the elections and whatever changes that took place. And also, even after that, the fact that the Rwandans are happy with what they have, or there is peace, there is security, there is continued progress in the country. So I think this is what gives evidence to the fact that what happened was the right thing. Even though at that time when we spoke, I wasn't sure that I would probably be called president again at this time. But the people of Rwanda had a different feeling about what was to happen, and they decided what should happen.
Okay, very good. I don't think I'll be still doing this by 2034, but in 2034, would I still call you Mr. President?
Well,
You're young enough.
there are things you can't decide that you have to leave to nature. I'm not sure that in another 10 years what will happen.
No, of course.
Yes, really depend
Congratulations
on
on the referendum, which you put forward to the people in the election. I could spend another 15, 20 minutes talking,
Yes.
but it's time for us to wrap. It's great to see you again. And
a
nice
pleasure.
round of applause for His Excellency Paul Kagame, the President of Rwanda.
Thank you. Thank you very much.